Quick thank you to the law school first for hosting us. We really appreciate the opportunity to come to this space. It's hard to get all of our states together in a convenient location, and this works reasonably well. So thank you very much for hosting us. Other partners that helped with the planning of this, the Nature Conservancy, chapters in different states, and the Regulatory Assistance Process Project, and the Vermont Council on Rural Development. So thank you all for helping to organize and think through how we would run this event. And thank you all for being here. You're all here because we need your brain power to think through how do we fully evaluate this program proposal that we're developing right now called the Transportation and Climate Initiative. All of our states share rural transportation challenges, and so we want to make sure that we're all thinking about them together so that we're not duplicating efforts and able to work together and find ways that the work that we're doing can be leveraged across state lines. One of the things that we realized fairly early on in our regional evaluation, and we'll go into more detail on TCI in a moment, is that there was a lack of focus on rural states and the unique challenges associated with our transportation needs versus, say, the more urban sectors of the region. And so we all came together, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont, to say, let's have this conversation together, let's start it here and broaden it from there. So thank you all for coming. It also is relevant to say that TCI may be a part of this overall puzzle, but we have transportation challenges regardless of whether or not we move forward with specific greenhouse gas reduction policies that we can work to address, and that some of the things that we do can either help or hurt those things. And so we need to be thinking through them in a thoughtful manner. And so today is really about, as I said, harnessing your brain power and harnessing your ideas and your vision for what the future of rural transportation could look like and how we might address some of those challenges and work together moving forward. So I really want to say, first of all, thank you. You were all selected to be here because of the interest and engagement that you bring to this discussion. When you start to think about creating a room of 120 people from 4 different states on rural transportation challenges, the potential list of invitees is huge. So we had to cull it down to you guys. We'll say, I won't pass judgment on what that really means, but thank you. And thank you especially those, if it's easier for Vermonters to come, I really appreciate those from other states who managed to make the trek, and the state leaders that are involved. So the way we're going to run through today is I'm going to give you a brief overview of the Transportation and Climate Initiative program, where we are, where we want your engagement, what we're in each of our states are thinking about and working to engage our publics in this conversation. And then we're going to do a short state official panel where we're going to talk about individually where our states are and what we're considering. And then we're going to open up the floor to some questions and answers for you before we get into the breakout sessions. The breakout sessions is where the meat of today is going to be. We want to know, what is the point of the breakout session? What are we trying to get out of this? That's really sort of why we're here today, is to say, if we're going to move forward with this evaluation of this type of policy, one of the features is what do we do? What programs are we investing in to make it easier for our citizens to be able to move around and to do so in a low emissions and cost savings manner? That in the sort of cap and invest piece of this program, that is the investment side, and we need input so that we can evaluate the program as a whole. It's easy to identify sort of what the potential initial costs might be, but what are the potential? It's much harder to evaluate the benefits without thinking through some of the specifics. So that's where we're going to get to today. We're going to do that through 6 breakout sessions. We'll go through those a little bit more in a minute. Actually, we're going to go through them right now. So there'll be 6 groups. Don't worry about this eye chart. It's in your agenda. The descriptions are in your agenda. It'll be a little easier. We're going to go through this again to show where they are as well, so that you know where the breakout sessions are going to be located. The groupings are along these lines, and these are the result of conversations that began in Massachusetts, in Western Mass, with their regional planning commissions and the Nature Conservancy and the state, talking about sort of what topics rose from local level planners. And so we've synthesized this to say these are broad categories. We realize they don't cover everything. We realize that there's lots of cross-pollination between them, and we want that to happen. We want ideas to come up from everywhere. So your main top focus areas are going to be public transit, alternative transportation, underserved populations, resilient infrastructure, land use and smart growth, low emissions transportation, and then this is sort of a catch-all, sort of the opportunities to change rural residents' relationship to transportation. Think of technology aspects, think of the way we offer goods and services to our rural populations in a way where they no longer have to drive to access them. That'll cover a number of topics and should be an interesting conversation. So that is the sort of basic where we're going to go, and we'll go through what the breakout sessions are going to do. Each one will be facilitated by a member of one of the state staff or one of the partners to help guide that process. But we plan to spend most of the morning trying to think through what are the specific points of vision for those individual sections that we're trying to drive towards. And then once we know what we're aiming at, which we don't often do in the policy realm, we sort of say what's the problem that's right in front of us and try to solve it. But where are we aiming? What are the issues that we need to, and then we'll get into the afternoon, we'll get in with those same groups into what are the solutions that help get us there, or what helps start to bend that curve, because we know we're not going to get there overnight. We also know that we're not going to solve these problems today, but it's really getting those thoughts on the table, the discussion going, so that we can all work together to address some of these issues. This slide is really small. It is not intended for you to read every word of it. What I'm looking to convey here is that in 2010, the state started a conversation around reducing emissions from the transportation sector. That group has grown now to include every state from Maine to Virginia, including the District of Columbia. We now call ourselves the jurisdictions because it's really a pain in the butt having one city involved. But we do what we can. We have been doing a lot of engagement with various communities and listening around the region to try to understand what it is that people are interested in a transportation system. And then as we did more and more research, the idea came up that in order to really evaluate a regional program, we would need to get into the specifics. We would need to show what does it actually say? What are the potential costs? What are the potential benefits for our residents, and how do we evaluate that? Without the specifics of that discussion, we were never going to be able to say one way or another. So we're all committed to making emissions reductions from our transportation sector, but how we get there matters, and so we really want to think it through in a thoughtful manner. It also matters that we do it at a regional level, because then we know that the transportation networks don't stop at state lines. The way fuels flows doesn't stop at state lines. All of those pieces, all of our driving networks interlace all together. I want to throw out one minor distinction from the slightly pinched map is that the three states that you see there that are a slightly different color did not sign on to the statement in December, but I want to make clear that especially for our Maine and New Hampshire counterparts, they've been part of the conversation this whole year trying to figure out what the project looks like, and so that we can bring it back to our state leaders for their decision making. So these are Vermont-specific stats, but I just wanted to put it in sort of stark contrast. The Vermont stats kind of work for the region as a whole. Vermont might be somewhat an outlier, probably on Maine, and Maine you probably match us pretty closely. Transportation emissions represent 43% of our overall greenhouse gas emissions. We have done, through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and other things, we've made tremendous progress in the electric power production sector, which at that point was the highest emitting piece for the country. That has now changed. Transportation has taken over as the biggest emissions problem across the country. So that's where we're seeing growth, that's where we're seeing need, and that's where we're seeing the greatest both opportunities and potential impacts on our economy as we move forward. This is a little bit harder to see. You actually have a version of it in your packet. It's a kind of a two-pager that Vermont put together, kind of describing what a cap and trade system is, and cap and invest system is, and how it would work. I recommend you following along because that's not easy to follow, but it's easier than me just using words to describe. What a cap and invest system does is sets a regulatory limit, a cap, on emissions that then declines, that may decline over time at some level. So we create what are called allowances, where people have to purchase those allowances, essentially a permit to emit so much greenhouse gases, and we have people buy those in an auction, and then they trade them back and forth among themselves. The goal being to then recycle that revenue that gets created in the auction back in our states for programs that are going to help our residents make transitions to different forms of energy, make different transportation choices, and make those programs accessible to everybody. So that then we lower the cost of compliance associated with the cap. The investment piece is one of the main reasons why we're here today, because how we invest those proceeds really matters. It matters to the impact on the overall price, and it matters to how we help our residents make those transitions. We in the region benefit from the fact that most of us are part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. We have an existing model, we have an existing governance structure, we all speak together on a regular basis around these issues. But at the same time, the electric power production sector is a little bit simpler because the generators, right, power plants, are all large point sources. There's a small number of them. We are all of the transportation emissions generators. So it becomes a much more complicated discussion when we are talking about how do we address all of our emissions rather than a few large power production facilities. This is the way RGGI has worked. We've got 9 states right now, I guess 10 states now. That slide needs to be updated because New Jersey has come back into the fold. Virginia is considering joining, and so we are working to expand and receive interest all the time of how we might go forward. So RGGI has largely been our model, but we also have models in Europe and in California and Quebec that we are following as well. One of the documents in your packet that came out yesterday is an updated framework for the program. We wanted to provide an update to all of the members of the public who have been really interested in this process to say, where are you? What are you thinking? We provided sort of general information, but we wanted to start getting into more specifics. So as you'll see in that document, 2 of the main components that are of critical importance to how this thing runs is, one, what fuels are covered. There are lots of different transportation fuels. We primarily think of gasoline and on-road diesel, but there are other transportation fuels that we could cover. From a clarity standpoint and from a general, the fact that not all transportation fuels are used in the same way in each state, we decided to stick with gasoline and on-road diesel. And to be clear, the fossil fuel component of that gasoline and on-road diesel. The other piece that really matters is we talked about each one of those generators that we all are, if we asked all of us to enter the auction, it would be incredibly complicated. We would have all sorts of issues. It wouldn't work. So we need to go upstream. So we did a fair amount of research to see how different states work together and how their regulation of fuels looks already. There is a concept out there that the Energy Information Agency uses called the prime supplier, that is essentially kind of the first person to bring a product in for sale in a state. That sort of worked, but it works mostly for a reporting platform. It doesn't necessarily fully answer all of our questions that we have as we get into more of a regulatory construct. So we're working to refine that and better understand exactly what that should look like. But that is the sort of upstream level we're talking about. We're not talking about at our level or at the gas station level or even at the sort of local distributor level. It's more about who's bringing it into the state or who's buying it from a terminal rack in the state. So we gave ourselves a year to develop this policy proposal. That is a rather aggressive timeline since a lot of it is built on modeling work that we are doing along the way to try to understand what the economic impacts of this, so we can come to our state leaders and to the public to describe the pros and cons of this policy option. The framework went out yesterday. We are accepting public comment on that now. We welcome your comment. There's a regional website for submitting that comment, so we hope that you will engage in that process. This is the next part is the big thing. In December of 2019, we anticipate releasing a draft memorandum of understanding, which essentially would be the glue that bind the states together should we choose to all go forward. We want comment on that. That will include several different options for how the cap might look and the modeling associated with it. That will be the time for all of you and all of our other constituents to engage with sort of what are our aspirations, what are our concerns about cost. All of those factors will come into play, and that will really be where there'll be an opportunity to look at the structure of what we put together so that we can then continue that conversation in each of our individual states. So at that point, we start to have sort of two parallel processes. There's going to be a process where we continue to work on for those states who continue to be interested in building out the structure of a program and the infrastructure around how we manage it. But then each state would, if they choose to go forward, needs to implement this how their legislation describes. For example, in Vermont, there's some question of whether or not we would need legislative authority. I know that there will be interest in that legislative conversation, so we will that will likely be a first step along the way. And then ultimately, there would need to be we would all need to enact the same rule. These act as individual state programs that then share the same auction platform. So it's a bit complicated, but we all enact the same rule and move forward. And we're anticipating all of that will sort of happen in the next 2 years, and that the idea was that we would be able to initiate the program with those people who are interested in the sort of 2022 timeframe. So that's what our modeling has constructed. There's a fair amount of work that needs to go on along the way, and all of that individual state legislative and regulatory process. We've had a lot of questions about sort of what happens in December, and is it just everybody goes full steam ahead? I want to make clear that there is lots of more process, even as we agree to what the proposal looks like. There'll be a lot more process along the way to work out the details and for each state to make this decision for themselves. At this point, I'm going to ask each of the members representing each of the other states to describe briefly what they're considering as they're evaluating this proposal, and then we'll allow you all to ask some questions of the panel, and Molly and Elle are going to run around with microphones for you so we can make sure we're captured on video. So, Becky, you want to start?
Sure. Hi, Becky Eller, New Hampshire. New Hampshire has been at the table with TCI since day one. In 2010, our Environmental, Transportation, and Energy Agency commissioners all signed off on the 2010 Declaration of Intent because, as Peter said, we recognize that when it comes to the transportation sector, we have to work together on this. It's our numbers in New Hampshire for the percentage of what the emissions are is pretty much right around Vermont's. We're at about 42% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the transportation sector. The majority of those are from the light duty vehicles, not the heavier duty vehicles. So it really presents an amazing challenge, particularly in, I think, the more rural states like ours. It's one thing to try to design a transit system or transportation alternatives if you're in a dense urban area. It's a little bit easier nut to crack. but to design a transit system or other alternative in our more rural areas that is not only in existence and effective, but needs to be attractive to the residents of that area presents a whole nother challenge. You run into issues with having enough funding to make the transit operation have enough runs in a day. Do people have to wait 2 hours for the next bus? That makes it very difficult. As Peter said, we're in New Hampshire, we're part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. We are familiar with how to do a cap and trade program, but the reason that the transportation sector didn't go first and hasn't made it there yet is because it's a whole lot harder. As Peter pointed out, just the sheer number of potentially regulated sources is huge, and they don't all stay in the same place. They move around. Well, New Hampshire did not sign the statement that was released in 2018. That doesn't mean, as Peter noted, that we're not continuing to participate. It's just that there was not a comfort level at in the top office with actually signing on and essentially implying a commitment at that point to adopt whatever is designed. I think New Hampshire has got a history of always being a little bit more conservative on that. And so we are, as Peter noted, we are at the table. We participate in every single meeting. We've got multiple staff that sit on all of the various work group calls because it's very important, and this is recognized at the highest levels in New Hampshire, that we are going to be impacted by any regional program that gets designed, whether we're part of it officially or whether we're an observer state. If there is a program that implements a price on the carbon emissions from transportation fuels one way or another, that will impact New Hampshire. What that impact will be, I think we don't know yet. We still have a lot of conversations to have with the fuel transporters to better understand how they do their pricing and will their pricing from the terminal. I mean, in New Hampshire, we don't have any terminal racks. All our fuel comes from Maine or Massachusetts or New York. And so when they pick up a load that's destined for New Hampshire, do they price it differently than they price it going to Massachusetts or Vermont or one of the participating states? So lots of things to consider like that as we continue with the evaluation. But as Peter noted, we have rural transportation issues that need to be solved, whether or not we're solving them under the umbrella of a TCI program or whether we're just simply looking at those within the confines of our existing resources. And so the purpose of this is to really help us better understand as we move forward, for number one, to make sure that we're representing that correctly in the TCI negotiations, but also just so that we have this higher understanding as well. One of the things about the potential for investments from TCI revenue is that I think a lot of people think about this and they think, you're going to buy more buses or you're going to paint bike lanes. But there's a lot of different ways to be created with a potential investment program. I think that one of the things that we're challenged with in New Hampshire is lack of broadband in the North Country. There is no internet access, so how can a business locate there? So all of our residents in those areas may have to drive long distances to jobs. Is it a greenhouse gas reduction program to provide broadband so that people don't have to drive so far? Probably. And it's also an economic development program. So there's ways to combine different interests that solves the needs of our economic development challenges as well as our greenhouse gases. So I think we've got a lot of work to do. I really appreciate everybody coming here. And this, as Peter noted, you are by invite only, and we really appreciate you sharing your time and your thoughts with us.
Thank you. I would agree with a lot of what Becky has just laid out for the state of Maine. Climate or addressing climate change is one of the governor's top priorities in her first handful of months, 8 months. We believe that she took some really bold steps. Number one, addressing our RPS, updating that, Number 2, establishing our Maine Climate Council, which I'll talk a little bit about in just a second. And then 3, addressing before the United Nations a commitment to being carbon neutral by 2045. And so building on those, how do we do that? What are the right steps? Emissions from transportation are about 54% of our mix, so a pretty significant chunk there, well above the national average, which is around 37, I believe. And so as a rural state, sparsely populated in the rural parts of the state, we have 1.3 million people total, and once you get above sort of the Augusta area and north, it really the population really begins to thin out. And so, how do we address all the challenges around those issues? For Maine, we spend about $5 billion a year, which is sent out of state for fossil fuel companies for transportation fuels. On average, Mainers drive about 15,000 miles a year. That's as of 2014 numbers. It's almost 1,000 miles more than the national average. So we know we need to address this. We know we need to deal with some of these issues, but the question is how you get there. We took a part in the VW settlement and used about $21 million for various initiatives for charging stations, but also looking at EVs and how do we accelerate that program, either with a pilot project for our state fleet, but also for residents, for Mainers to participate in that. And so there's a range of things that we're currently doing, but we know we definitely need to be doing more. And so as part of the Maine Climate Council, there is a transportation working group, which is going to be really digging into these issues with a lot more detail coming up in the next, sort of 6 to 10 months. We'll be expanding the infrastructure around EVs and also expanding the EV program. We'll probably be looking at things like biofuels, there are options there. Broadband, I totally agree with what Becky had laid out. That's certainly a strategy for us for those rural communities, keeping those vibrant. Public transit in some areas of Maine might work really well, and as we broaden out into the rural areas, are the ways that we can do through ride sharing and other services to sort of enhance that. And then finally, let me just sort of dig in a little bit on the current challenges we have with our roads and bridges. Right now, there's a working group going on in Maine to look at a $200 million a year funding need for roads and bridges. Right now, a lot of that is made up through traditional general obligation bonds. We do about $100 million a year in bonding. And so we know that long term that's not sustainable. So how do we address that? We have 23,000 miles of roads. About 9,000 of that are state roads, and then the balance would be local roads, whether that be municipal jurisdiction or county. Our current our gas tax right now to meet that $200 million figure would have to be somewhere between 25 and 30 cents. Now that's not on the per pump, the per gallon pump price, but it factors in there. And some of the things that group is looking at is, a modest increase in the gas tax, somewhere around 5 to 8 cents. What does that mean? That would generate about 70 million, so we can begin addressing the sort of traditional roads and bridge issue, and then that would alleviate some pressure on traditional bonding, and we can use that funding for other sort of climate resources, potentially some of these options. And so a whole suite of challenges that we have about balancing our traditional roads and our upgrades there with taking advantage of or reducing the emissions through TCI. And so Maine has been involved monitoring and participating for many years under our previous administration. And so that was a difficult kind of road for our state agency staff. And so as we come out of that, how can we be more engaged, making sure that, again, we balance those needs, but also making sure that we are making wise choices for our rural communities.
Great, thanks. Well, first off, thanks to Peter and the whole Vermont team for organizing this and having us up here today. And thanks to a lot of the partners and groups that I know have been kind of working tirelessly on this initiative throughout the past few years. I think that, while it's the sort of states who are sitting at the table being the actual members and, designing this program, it's not without the the sort of support and advocacy that we get from a lot of the groups that are represented here today, that, we wouldn't be where we are as far as our framework and the momentum that we have without that. So Massachusetts has taken TCI as a huge priority. It's one of the #1 priorities for Governor Baker in his second term. I think there's sort of two main driving forces behind that. I think, as some folks know, Massachusetts has the Global Warming Solutions Act, which calls for emissions reductions, the first of which is coming up in 2020. It's 25% below 1990 levels. And I think, much like all the other states, Massachusetts has gotten a lot of progress in the electric generation sector, but transportation emissions still account for about 40% of our emissions portfolio. So I think that we recognize that looking at 2020 and looking out to 2030, 2040, 2050, there's really no way to meet those reductions without really getting aggressive and doing a lot of work within the transportation sector. And I think Governor Baker has seen it as a major priority to work on those issues regionally and partner with the states that are represented here today and throughout the initiative. Another piece of work that was done in Massachusetts sort of leading up to our main participation this year was the Future of Transportation Commission, which I know a few of the folks here today participated in, which kind of looked at sort of scenario planning and transportation evolution going out to 2040. And one of the main recommendations of that report was, if we're going to kind of be serious and address our climate goals, that we need to work regionally to develop a cap and invest type of program, such as what we're starting to propose within the Transportation Climate Initiative. I think Massachusetts has a bit of a unique perspective in this. On one side of the state, we have a major metropolitan area with a huge public transportation network that needs a lot of work, a lot of investment. And in the other side of the state, we have a pretty large rural population that faces its own sort of needs and challenges. And I think that, we've tried to make a real priority to not lose sight of each of those, sort of goals and priorities as we move this project forward. We spent this summer doing, I think, 6 different kind of workshops around the state and trying to hit everything from environmental justice, urban populations, to being out in Pittsfield and Springfield, some more western part of the state, to try to engage a lot of the more rural populations. And I think, we really started to get an understanding of just how complex transportation is, of an issue when you get into the more rural areas of the state. I think from a few different perspectives. I mean, there's not... Reducing transportation emissions in the more rural areas is not as simple as just leaving your car in the driveway and getting on the bus or the subway. And I think, conversely to that, it's also gets a little more complicated when you start to figure out how you can kind of target investments to support that, type of population and to support those transportation reductions. And I think one of the main things that we started to really hear through that process was, the things that work in the city don't necessarily work in the more rural areas of the state, and that, as policymakers, we really need to make sure that we're staying, paying attention to that and connecting with groups like today to really get a sense of what the sort of rural challenges and needs are out there. I know that a lot of what we kind of heard is represented in the breakout group topics today, so I think we're really looking forward to participating in that and taking a lot of what we hear today and feeding that back into our process back in Massachusetts. We'll be going out for another series of, I think, 5 or 6 kind of workshops, following up on the ones that we did this summer in October and possibly into November. So we'll be going out through the Berkshires again. So this sort of theme of just kind of working with, the various populations and making sure that we're representing all corners of the state in the program development, but also implementation is one that's really a priority for us. So we're grateful and happy to be here today and look forward to really taking everything that we learned from here back, into our work for the rest of the program.
All right, thanks to all of you. I'm going to be brief since you've already listened to me talk enough and it's pretty toasty in here and we need to get moving and get to some questions. Vermont has taken the approach of very clearly show us what this means, right? The direction that we've been given by the governor is to go out and build this program and see what it looks like for Vermont. Engage people along the way, understand their needs, try to figure out how it interacts with all the different constituencies involved, and then come back with a proposal, and so that we can have a conversation on the details. And so that's really what we're working through. As we get into today's discussion, Many of the topics are not directly related to transportation, or ultimately won't be directly related to transportation, because most of our transportation is an effect of our modern economy and society, right? Most of the driving emissions we have don't result from us choosing to go for a casual Sunday drive, right? They're a result of where we live, where we work, where our schools are, where our goods and services are, all of those things. So that is a much bigger conversation than simply saying we need people to drive less or we need them to switch vehicles. It is potentially all-encompassing, and we need to be thinking about what does the sort of physical manifestation of our structure look like over the course of time. So thank you all for listening to us talk, and we'd invite questions now. Somebody has to have a question. You are all incredibly engaged people. Somebody's got to wonder what the heck we're talking about. Alex DePillis.
Hi, Alex from the Agency of Ag in Vermont. I do energy and climate. I don't do much with transportation. And when I listen to your talking, I'm thinking, where's the line on mobility? Like, there was talk about broadband, telework. Would this include, in your minds, smart growth, like giving money to a community who does something that maybe lessens transportation demand? Really curious about the line. So, for example, for me, from the ag sector, wow, wouldn't it be great if we could get money for biodiesel production? But that isn't really mobility. So I'm curious how you see that question of others. At some point, we'll talk about this, I'm sure, during the day. Where's the line?
So one thing I want to make clear that may not have been clear is that so this is a sort of regional development process, but ultimately all the decisions on what to do with the resources come down to individual state decisions. And so we're not going to we as the region are not going to set where those lines might be, because this is a decision for each state. And I think you've highlighted areas where there aren't lines, right? There's no line between whether a community, a village in southern Vermont is looking to expand and become that smart growth hub that it wants to be, but because of septic capacity or drinking water capacity, it can't do it, right? Is that a small investment there a better overall impact in the long run than something else? So those are things that we're going to have to evaluate throughout. But I don't see there as being a strong line there, and that's why we're having all of these conversations in very entangled sorts of ways.
I would add that one of the things that we heard in our sort of workshops around the state, especially as we got out to Western Massachusetts, was don't have a line when you're going into this, to really, go into it kind of thinking creatively and outside the box, because there's, a lot of traditional transportation policies that have worked well, and there's a lot that really haven't. And this is, kind of a unique opportunity where we're building a program from the ground up, and, we're looking at potential revenue coming in. So, I think sort of Peter's point a little bit, we're kind of approaching it, with no kind of fine line of what's in and what's out. And I think kind of conversations, like today will really help to feed into that thought process as we move forward.
I'll just add on that sort of in the early days of TCI in 2010 when we were first formed, our original focus at that time really was looking at how do we create sustainable communities? How do we help our communities design for smart growth? What are things that can be done at the state level that would enable that sort of action at the local level? So I think that everything is on the table. We can't, this problem can't be solved by electrifying all of the vehicles or by putting everybody on transit. That any one action in and of itself won't do it. It won't get us to where we need to be. So it is definitely an all of the above approach.
Hi, guys. Thanks. A question about the federal context. In the context of the current administration pushing back on California and their waiver, what role has the federal government played in this process? And are you getting pushback, or do you expect to get some as you move forward, or as we move forward?
To this point, there's been no engagement at the federal level. We've been following the model that Reggie has followed and that has been tested in the courts about whether it's legal, and so we're following that approach to this point.
I hope one of the things we'll discuss within the groups, and not to hijack the larger conversation, but especially for the states with the coastal communities, we need to have the conversation about what does managed retreat look like in the coastal states. What does that then look like as it pushes further inland? Because one of the questions we have, I'm in with Wyndham Regional Commission in Southeast Vermont. Right now, we're not necessarily seeing the statistics, but we're beginning to see some exurban, I think, like purchasing of homes in Southeast Vermont for commuters to Amherst, Northampton. Even one family moved here from that I just sold my truck to, moved to Whitingham, Vermont, which is not in the middle of anywhere. And the wife commutes to Hadley, Mass, to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service every day. And the husband is starting a 20-acre, wants to do a hop farm and with sheep. Now, I'm just saying, I'm thinking we need to look at, from a transportation perspective, kind of normal ex-urban development that you would expect, but then also the climate push. And then we also need to take into account when we get the 38 hurricane again, what does that do as far as driving people inland? So I hope we don't have a kind of a crisis of imagination in thinking this through, because other parts of the country are already experiencing it. And I think we're experiencing it some too. It's just more slow. And the temptation nationwide has been to continue really like the national sprawl, right? Why is it cheaper to develop in other places? They're continuing greenfield development. It's not that easy here, but and so we may not see those same kinds of pressures that the southern states and others have, but I think we're going to see our turn. I just hope we'll have that broader conversation and not just look at exactly the way things are now.
Thanks, Chris.
If I can just say that I think that's a really important point, and I think that the resiliency and preparedness has to be a part of all of the planning that we do. We're fortunate in New Hampshire that it's actually a person on my team is our lead for the resiliency and adaptation work in New Hampshire. We've been doing a lot with our coastal communities. One of our coastal communities, Hampton, floods on almost every single high tide now. And having conversations about potential retreat are really, really difficult. But it's, and it goes beyond just the roadways flooding. They're having, saltwater infiltration with their water systems and the like. So yeah, transportation is not a silo. It's all part of the broader conversation of climate change impacts.
Yeah, I would agree. I would just say that, for our governor, the message that we've gotten is that we want to be open-minded and flexible about all of these options. And part of the climate council that I described a little bit earlier was around just that, not being closed-minded about anything, but have these conversations when we have coastal islands that are feeling huge impacts with sea level rise and other climate effects. And so we want to be really flexible and be able to address those issues, with an open mind.
Peter, my question's for you. Lisa Altman Hall, University of Vermont. I just wondered if you could go back to RGGI and how you described it, because I don't have trouble wrapping my head around a cap and trade system and how it works, but I'm wondering how you envision RGGI and TCI operating as two distinct things. Obviously, the indirect effects and the market effects between the two will be real, but how do you imagine them being able to work as two distinct things? I know you kind of said it quickly, but I think if you'd try me again, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think this, I'll open it up to others afterwards, because one of the things we've been thinking about throughout is what's the interaction between the two potential marketplaces. Obviously, RGGI exists. There's a marketplace for buying allowances for tons of carbon there. Is there an interaction between the two? At this point, we see them being separate entities. But down the road, we're pondering what it would look like to see if there was a linking opportunity to those. Essentially, saying a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon, and you can buy it in either market. That is a slightly more challenging conversation, given that the states don't totally overlap, and the history and cap trajectory of the programs will be different, and so trying to figure out how that might look and work is slightly more complex than meets the eye.
Yeah, I would just add that, I think we've kind of, as states, decided that we're not necessarily going to come up with a program that links immediately, but let's make sure that in program design that we're not doing anything that would kind of preclude us from leaking, either in a future program review or a certain amount of years down the road. So I think it's something that we're taking a lot of look into as we do this program development.
Hi, Justin Johnson from MMR here in Montpelier in Vermont. So just a couple of things. First on that, is this program going to be a ton of carbon, or is it going to be a short ton of carbon like Reggie? It'd be great if it was a real ton, but that's just by the by. My question is...
No bias there.
My question is on the complementary policies and your thinking around, say, something like low carbon fuel standard. I know in a lot of the conversations about this, some features of a low carbon fuel standard seem to bleed into this and the investment side. And given that California, for instance, has a cap and invest program and a low carbon fuel standard, and frankly, the low carbon fuel standard is where a lot of the investment in transportation change is actually being driven. I just wondered about your thoughts about how that fits, when it fits, if it fits, what sort of thinking you've had around that.
I'm not going to go too much in depth in terms of the regional conversation around it because I want to respect the confidentiality and privacy of my colleagues, but it's certainly a topic of conversation, and whether that's appropriate at the regional level we're not there yet. We got a lot of work to do here. But obviously that is a factor in the California piece, but I don't think, we're certainly not going to be ready to include that as part of the effort, so.
Hello, Jonathan Rubin, University of Maine. And I appreciate very much your open-mindedness here and your focusing on economic development and these other important issues. And I would just, I'd throw out an idea which you may not, I'd look for comment, which is 60% of Maine homes use home heating oil, which is essentially identical to diesel. And I'm just wondering if you can imagine a system of offsets like the RGGI system that allows for other sectors to contribute where appropriate.
Well, I think, again, nothing is precluded at this point. I guess, sort of in the early days of TCI, there was a lot of conversation about whether we broaden this to include the home heating fuels. And the thinking at the time was that increases the weight of the lift. And so to get a program off the ground, we decided to restrict to the transportation sector. But I think the potential for offsets is really part of the discussion of what the program design will be. Clearly RGGI does have some offsets. They're not widely used. I think the experience with RGGI is that I think any offsets that are generated here are sold into the California market, not into our local RGGI market. But again, it's all part of the program design conversations.
Hi, Jennifer Wallace-Broder with the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation. So I'm wondering, in terms of the investment strategy, are you going to be putting some parameters about how dollars are invested in the way that they reduce emissions? And part of the reason I'm asking that is because there's great transportation needs that among the elderly, among disabled, low-income populations that actually don't have any access to transportation now. They may not have a car or can't drive. And so, and they may not sort of immediately reduce emissions if we provide solutions for those needs. And so I'm wondering if there's been any thought to how those strategies are going to be addressed, because I think they're important to bringing people along in this process, but they may not immediately show emissions reductions.
So, Jennifer, I answer your question this way. I think, as you've heard, there aren't very many options that are off the table at this point in terms of how we could invest those proceeds. But the interaction between the cap And what we invest those proceeds in really matters, because the more emissions reductions we get from those investments, the cheaper it is to comply with the cap. And so it does have a real impact. So in many ways, we are trying to look to find balance, but we are really, as you've heard, these are really about sort of broad thinking around what transportation demand looks like and how we address both, sort of underserved and really non-served populations as we go along.
Is it on? Great. Hi, Phil Huffman with the Nature Conservancy here in Vermont. I want to just start by thanking you and really applauding your 4 states and the 4 of you and the other folks on the 4 state teams for your leadership in TCI generally, and particularly on getting to the focus on the rural side of things, and to congratulate you on getting as far as you have with yesterday's announcement, and a really important step forward. And I think, obviously the turnout today is a reflection on the hope, I guess, and the desire to help to propel this effort forward, doing whatever we all can to support you. And I guess I'm wondering 2 things. This spotlight on the rural part of things is so critical for our 4 states. And knowing that there are rural components to some of the other states further to the south, but there also is obviously a much different geographical and sort of land use patterns down there and whatnot, much more urbanized. And so I'm wondering if you could just speak to what the dynamic is like within the 12 states plus DC overall region around this rural, suburban, urban dynamic, and the very different challenges, as was highlighted before, that relate to those different geographies. And then I guess I'm also just curious, big picture, on what your perspectives are of, you've come a long way at this point, but there's still a lot still to be figured out, and what your sort of crystal ball is for the coming months, and that sort of series of next steps that you outlined earlier on. Thanks.
I guess I could take a shot at both of those. I think first off, I think all of the states have really prioritized kind of transparency and equity and sort of participation, and making sure that they're engaging residents of all different kind of demographics and populations sort of, around their states. I think, we have huge population centers in the group. We also have vast, massive, rural areas, not just represented up here today, but when you start to talk about parts of Virginia and Pennsylvania. So I think the kind of needs and perspectives and demographics across all the states really runs the gamut. But I think that, each state has really made a priority of trying to work together across the region to hear what folks, really have to say and want to have input in the program across the region, but also do a lot of work at home in state, making sure that the folks that you represent at the table are really having their voices heard in the process. I think on the second part, I would say my crystal ball is the schedule that was released yesterday. I think all the states, really have made it a priority to follow that and carry that through over the coming months. I think, like all the work we've done so far, it's aggressive, and I think it's, work that we're going to need continued support and partnership from a lot of, groups like TNC and a lot of the other groups here today. But, I'm really confident, and have been, really positive in the interactions and meetings that we've had with, with all the states, including most recently a couple weeks ago. Peter hosted us all up in Montpelier, Vermont, and I think we have a really good group of people kind of working towards a common goal on this. So I'm really confident of where we're headed.
Yeah, I would just say that as far as where I see things going, and the crystal ball part of your question, given that the transportation sector represents 54% of our emissions, we will have to address that. That's going to be one of the top priorities coming out of our climate council. what those recommendations are, what that looks like. I think, it'll still be, it'll be up to that group in a lot of ways. And I think an important piece of it will be this idea of economic development for rural economies in rural Maine. That's also a big focus of the administration. And so how those two overlap, where they overlap, I think will be really important, because not only is this an emissions issue, but it's also a really important education issue for the rural communities. And then, like I said, an important economic development piece. So I think all of those will work hand in hand.
Carolyn Wesley from the Energy Action Network in Vermont, sort of building on all of this, thinking about the importance of a broad diversity of perspectives, a diversity of strategies, not having a crisis of imagination. I'm curious about, for each of you, who has been sort of the stakeholder or partner in your state or beyond who has most expanded either your personal thinking or state leadership thinking about what it would take for this to be successful, and how?
I think you just stumped the panel.
I think I would say for myself, just given my normal portfolio, I've found a lot of insight from, I think, two, kind of separate but equally important groups. And one has been really looking at some of the environmental justice issues, that have kind of compounded over time in some of the more urban areas of Massachusetts, and how you address those in a program like this. But I think also the folks kind of on the ground in our sort of RPAs and stuff like that in the more rural parts of the state have been really helpful. I think there's a lot of the groups that have been incredible on this, and a lot of them are represented today, are kind of environmental advocacy groups that we deal with on a consistent basis on a huge number of issues. I think that this has connected us more into some of the real roots community, networks, and I think that that's beneficial for both this process, but also throughout, our day job as kind of policy makers in our state.
I'm going to call attention to somebody in the room who's been helpful to me over the past few years thinking about transportation. Bethany Fleischman from Vital Communities, who sat on the Governor's Climate Action Commission with several of the people in this room and me, helped me think about transportation and access to public transportation and other services in a different way. Right, that we can throw more money on public transit, but unless we figure out how to actually meet the needs of people who are traveling or would like to be traveling, we're just throwing money down the drain, and we're spending money in lots of different ways coming from different sources. And unless we figure out how to unite some of those sources, we're going to continue to do it inefficiently and therefore not be able to meet those needs. So thank you, Bethany.
Yep, I think for me, so two people, we've had a lot of conversations within the governor's office, but two in particular would be Bruce Van Note, who's our commissioner of our Department of Transportation, and also Hannah Pingree, who's the head of our Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future. And both of them have really sort of talked a lot about the needs of rural communities, the needs of transportation in those rural communities, and I think given the governor a broader perspective of what all the issues are.
I guess I'd say in New Hampshire, the primary focus of the sort of the vocal groups has been electrification of the transportation sector, and so, but that's not necessarily within the umbrella or under the umbrella of TCI. It's just a general push in New Hampshire. I think that I guess I'm not sure that TCI is maybe as well known in New Hampshire as it is in some of the other states in terms of what the potential is for a regional program. I think it's been a little bit under the radar, and so it's really been more individual issue focused than comments specifically about TCI.
Yeah, I would just echo that point. I think that's what we hear more than anything else. It's put together programs that address our challenges. They don't really care how we get there. It's the solutions that matter to people.
Hi, I'm Peggy O'Neill from Vermont Clean Cities. So I work primarily with fleets across the state to help them reduce greenhouse gas emissions and consider alternative fuels. And I know a lot of the conversation is about light duty. At what point will you kind of incorporate the medium and heavy duty vehicles? A lot of this is moving people, but the heavy duty move the goods in and out of some of these rural areas. We work with biodiesel here in the state, CNG, propane, and the potential exists certainly in the landfill areas and on dairies. Alex, where are you? For renewable natural gas. So looking at those other options that I think might be a little bit different, considering the heavy and medium duty vehicles.
Yeah, for us, that is a big concern and a big issue that we want to address. So two things. One, I think biofuels is an option for us. And then sitting behind you are two people from Maine that will be closely involved in TCI and also the Transportation Working Group of the Climate Council, Dana Duran and Matt Marks. Dana represents the forest products side of things, and specifically the loggers, and Matt represents a lot of the trucking companies and sand and gravel folks. So they'll be closely involved in whatever solutions we develop over the coming months.
Yeah, I think likewise in New Hampshire, we're not, to begin with, a good shout out for a really great event, the Bi-State Electric Vehicle Connector last week. That was a joint effort of Vermont Clean Cities and the Granite State Clean Cities. And I think that we view our Clean Cities program as the strongest advocate for making sure that we don't forget that medium and heavy duty sector, and for also bringing the voices from those from those entities to us. I think it's helpful that our Clean Cities program is a part of our DES. In fact, Jessica's on my staff. So I think that we really value that connection and look to that program to be sort of that voice at the table.
All right, let's have one more question, and then we're going to get to sort of getting to the point where we get to the breakout sessions. Or we'll just go directly there. Again, your eye chart, if you can't read this, and I'm sorry I can't help you, but no, we'll leave it up. So ideally, everybody can pick which group they're most interested in. We may have to do some leveling of groups across but the goal is to have, sort of 10 to 20 in each group to have a robust conversation. As I mentioned this morning, is really about setting those points of vision. What are we trying to achieve in each of those areas? What's that long-term goal, so that we can get beyond the sort of what some of the immediate pushes are to help us drive towards sort of whether those are smart growth changes or economic development opportunities or broadband or whatever those might be, sort of that are going to require investment now but are going to have huge payoffs later on. And so I look forward to everybody participating in each of those. Your list is again in your agenda, but the where they're going to be. Maybe, Molly, can you come up and describe where those are going to happen?
Okay, so there might be a slight difference in your handout versus what's up here. We're actually going to be, okay, it is right, where it's in 207. It may say 107 on your handout for the Oaks one. But the way you get to the rooms, two of them are going to be in here. There'll be one on the upper level. There'll be one here on the lower level. For the others, you're going to go out the doors. The Yates room, Yates 104, will be, if you were heading to the bathrooms, just keep on going. It's that room right there. The other rooms follow the arrows. There are red arrows. The 207 room is upstairs. I will be available if anyone wants directions.
All right, at this point, we'll reconvene in those groups at 10:45, so take some time to talk amongst each other, get some coffee, and stretch your legs.